Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Sam Gill, Senior Advisor to the President and Vice President for Communities and Impact at the Knight Foundation. How are you doing today, Sam?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's my pleasure, and I hope that you're staying warm and dry today. I know the East Coast is kind of covered with rain at the moment.
Well, Knight's headquartered in Miami, so we can't. It's raining today, but it would be immoral to complain. So
I don't know. I'm not a huge Miami fan, so I might complain a fair bit there. But I hope you're not a Heat fan too, because then we'll have real problems here. But
no, I grew up in Minnesota. Timberwolves finally rising from obscurity. It's no sports loyalty there.
Well, very good. Well, I wonder if we can kind of start off, Sam, by how you sharing a little bit about how you define the work that you do.
Yeah, happy to. So, Knight Foundation is the wealth of John S. and James L. Knight, and they built and ran the Knight newspaper company, which at its peak was the largest newspaper company in the country. And what they really believed was that that if communities had the information that they needed to make decisions and the ability and the pathways to make those decisions together, that they could really determine their own futures. That's really what they saw as the bedrock of democracy. That's how they ran their paper. They really ran a paper that fit the communities where each of the Knight newspapers were. The editorial boards could take different positions. There was a deep connection to each place. The Akron Beacon Journal was Akron's newspaper. The Charlotte Observer was Charlotte's newspaper. So we've really tried to take that ethos into our own work. What we try to do is to invest the wealth that they gained in more informed and engaged communities, in enabling communities to have access to those same tools that the Knight brothers saw as essential for democracy. So our work includes a national program in journalism. It includes a communities program that's really focused on the places where the Knight brothers grew their wealth, and an arts program, which is also focused on a particular set of communities.
Well, I'm wondering, one of the key factors that I took away from your explanation there was really about the contextualization of these papers that they did, and then I'm wondering kind of how you guys have managed to continue that making sure that you share wisdom across communities, but making sure that each community is dealing with these questions in their own kind of way.
Yeah. So the way we approach our work in community is that we really think of ourselves as of the community in the same way the Knight brothers thought about their newspapers. So instead of having an idea that we dream up in Miami and trying to take it to communities, we actually have a team, people who live in these places. And what their responsibility is to say, what's going on here that Knight can tap into? Where is there momentum or an opportunity where Knight, with limited resources, can accelerate, can build on, can invest in something that's already moving that will enable the community to be more informed and engaged? And what that demands of us is a few things. The first is you're really being plugged into what's happening in a place. The second is to be willing to do different things in different places. In Philadelphia, we're investing in the city's public spaces as a platform for civic engagement. In Miami, we're investing in connecting a burgeoning, high-growth entrepreneurial scene. In St. Paul, we're incredibly focused on the energy downtown. The effort to transform St. Paul from a prosperous but sort of old industrial city into a dense urban core where people want to live and want to work and want to play. Those are really different things. if we were starting from scratch, you might not work on so many different things. But we're not starting from scratch. Just like the newspapers, we're starting in and among actual places that have different opportunities and, frankly, different challenges that face them.
Well, I'm very intrigued by the sense that some of the work that you guys do are national level issues. So, income inequality, trust in the press, and the communication networks that challenge all of us. But you also guys have very clearly taken a local impact to that. And so I'm wondering how you balance this knowledge that these are national issues that sometimes require national level solutions, while also looking at what are the places where we can impact this on a local level.
Yeah, I think there are very few challenges that any sector tries to take on, whether it's philanthropy, civil society, government, or the private sector, that don't, at the end of the day, require efforts from different people at different levels. So, I would suggest there's almost no issue happening in cities today that wouldn't in some way be benefited by efficacious action from the federal government or efficacious action from the state government. But that's not all that's going to be important. So I'll just give you an example. In San Jose, which is a community we invest in, it's impossible to think about San Jose as separate from the region of which it's a part, Silicon Valley. So for some people, it's a region. For other people, it's a state of mind. But it's whatever it is, it's real. And it's got major regional challenges that are way bigger than anything Knight Foundation can really take on, or more importantly, than anything Knight Foundation can directly influence. Really critical issues, though. How is that region going to have affordable housing that's going to make that economy work? How is that region going to take on a traffic and planning challenge that only gets more daunting by the day? Our work in San Jose has been really focused on the sort of identity of the city and the way in which people who live in San Jose are able to come together in the city's parks and public spaces to build that identity. Now, on the one hand, that is a place where there's a lot of activity that we can invest in, that we can enable to happen more quickly, where we can serve as a convener. But on the other hand, that's our way of investing in the kind of civic fabric that's ultimately going to be required to address those other issues. Those issues, housing, traffic, inequality, they're going to require other people to do things as well. But they'll be aided by, a civic culture that's able to say, how are we going to shape the future of San Jose? And our most proximate transformative opportunity to do that is around this sort of culture of the place, is around the public spaces that enable that. I think those are the kinds of choices that anyone has to make. Where can I make the biggest difference against these grand challenges?
Well, I think, there's a lot of universal truth in that. And I think one of the big questions that I always come back to is this question of how do we create shared vision in communities or in any space. And so I think, hearing you talk about that, if you can create that shared vision around one idea or one concept, that's a tool that we can then use to help create shared vision for the community more broadly, isn't it?
Yeah. And I found that, that especially because what we care about, again, is that idea of having the information and the ability to shape the destiny of a community. One of the things we've seen is sometimes that vision is there, and then the job of a foundation, and it's also the job of a major employer, and it's also the job of the government, is to say, how do I see myself in that community vision? Where am I going to drive impact, and where do I need to get out of the way? Sometimes that vision isn't there. And so then you do have to ask that question. Where could that vision form? What could we do to help enable it? In Detroit, a city where Knight is investing, where there's a lot of major foundations that are a part of the effort to revitalize that city. Our work lately has been, there's investments happening. People believe in Detroit. The question is, who gets to shape that vision? So we've been investing in innovative journalism projects that help people connect to information about what's going on in that revitalization, how decisions are being made. We're also investing in innovative ways to facilitate civic participation. Can residents get information about policy decisions? Can they talk directly to elected officials? So in Detroit, it's much more about building that fabric. In other places we invest, Philadelphia, I mentioned earlier, where we invest in public places, there really is a vision that these public spaces are going to be a critical part of helping neighborhoods across Philadelphia redevelop, move forward, deliver prosperity to their residents, give residents a voice. That vision's out there, and we've influenced it, we've helped to shape it, and now we and others want to see ourselves within it.
Well, I think one of the things, so we're based in Roanoke, Virginia here, and one of the things that is certainly true here, but I think it's probably true everywhere, is that there's always going to be more than one narrative that's true about a community. And I wonder kind of how you guys make sure that when you're going into a community, I know that you guys have people in that community, but how do you make sure that you're embracing all the different narratives and choosing where to plug in the right place?
Well, you got to listen. I mean, you've got to listen. We spend a lot of time talking about what we think is going on in these places. And there are different places you can go for that. Obviously, pounding the pavement is a critical one. What are different people in different parts of this community saying about where it is, what's happening, and where it needs to go? That's one thing that we spend time doing. There's obviously data that you can look at, that can tell you a lot about the particular position of a community and can give you some information about some of the possible destinies for a community. Some of that data is quantitative data, and some of it's qualitative data. And I think one of the reasons that we have that we really believe in the people that live and work in these places as a part of Knight Foundation is that at the end of the day, you've got to make a choice, and the choice that you make isn't the only choice. I think one of the mistakes that we can make is that the narrative that we might choose, or the opportunity or the story that's being told that we might choose is the only one. It's not the only one. It might be the one where we see a role to play, but then you've got to listen, and then you've got to be open to the idea that you're wrong. I mean, foundations especially have to be open to the idea that they can be wrong over time. One of the great things about foundations is you can be wrong and it's not game over. If you can listen, then you can change, then you can pivot, then you can find new opportunities to pursue.
I think that ties into one of the things I admire most about what you guys do. And, through the years with CityWorks, we've had connections to a number of folks that have worked with you guys either now or in the past. Charles Thomas and Josh McManus have both been guests on the show here. And it's one of the things that impresses me most is that you guys have this tolerance for risk that I think is rare in many places or in many organizations. And I wonder kind of how you guys understand risk and how you make sure that you're always willing to take appropriate risks.
I think we start with, again, what can we leverage? What can we tap into? What's the opportunity in this community? And then we say, if we think this is really the best place for us, are we thinking about the risks in the right way? So let's take a real example. In Miami, again, what we're investing in is high growth, tech-enabled entrepreneurship. What in the world is the foundation doing investing in that? Isn't that a job for the private sector? Well, the way we got there was there's myriad problems that in any city of this size that Knight Foundation could be working on. But we listened. Matt Hagman, who was the program director at the time in Miami for Knight Foundation, his successor, Raul Moas, who just joined, has actually been involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But Matt Hagman was a reporter. And so he pounded the pavement and he listened. And what people were telling him was, look, this is happening. Miami is becoming a global city. There's new kinds of investment. No one's talking about it. But what it's missing is connection. No one is connecting the disparate efforts. Well, that is a great place for a foundation to be. We can invest in places where people come together. We can invest in events. There are things a foundation could do that could create that connectivity and generate a much larger return than investing in something that's important, but where we can't really have a major additive impact. And that looks different in every community. So instead of starting with the premise of we want to take risks, we started with how can we have an impact? Once we figured out where we could have a unique impact, then frankly, the risk calculation took care of itself.
Well, I know that one of the areas that you guys are specifically interested in taking on now is this place of smart city. And I want to start with this kind of question that I think is important as we start with this, is that, we have these terms, sustainable development, placemaking, and I think smart city is getting to this place where we're not sure, it's become so broad that I don't know if we even know what it means anymore. So I want to ask you kind of how you guys define that smart city idea.
Yeah. I mean, the way that we define the smart city is how technology is enabling communities to solve the most important challenges they face. And we define it that broadly because, again, this isn't about what our idea is, it's about what's happening in community. And what's happening in community is that a lot of different people with a lot of different definitions of the smart city are moving forward. I mean, it's happening. Technology is being deployed, leveraged, mobilized to solve big city problems. It's coming from government, it's coming from the private sector, and it's coming from, everybody in a community who's carrying, one of these things. I'm waving my phone. Who's carrying one of these things around. If you're carrying a smartphone around to call Uber, to order food, and to renew your driver's license or pay a parking ticket, you are a definition of the smart city, because you are using technology to undertake transactions within a community. And so rather than trying to define this is what the smart city is, we're asking a different question. Technology is sweeping across cities. Are residents at the middle of that? Again, it's just right back to the Jack and Jim Knight question. Are the residents, is the community shaping its own destiny? And the reason that we actually see this as a big opportunity is because it's happening. Because it's already happening in cities, we can leverage that investment and that energy, and hopefully we can invest in people who really are trying to put the resident back at the center. And that's really the way the Knight brothers ran their business. They didn't show up saying, the news industry will never change. They were constantly asking the question, how does technology change, accelerate, or enable what I'm trying to do, which is to help a person who lives here get the information they need to move this place forward.
Well, I think that's fascinating. And one of the questions that I often come up with is, how do we, in a world where technology is moving so fast that I think we have trouble understanding it, even the impacts of what happened a few years ago, how do you really make sure that we're focusing on how this impacts people and how it benefits people when there's so many different parties in play and there are people working on innovations that we can't even fathom right now that are going to be here in 3-4 years?
Yeah. Well, some of it is that we're trying to stay open and balanced. So we're thinking a little bit about what the future could hold, but we're also working with communities who are reacting to what's happening now. Our focus has really been on a few areas. So first, we're really interested in exploring how cities can take advantage of real-time and crowdsourced data. Partially because this is a place where there is momentum. Cities, there's more and more data available at cities, and city halls, and frankly, civil society groups are more equipped than they ever have been to work through this information. Second, we're talking to a lot of our communities about how to enable residents to get engaged on the actual design of services. Some of those services are technology enabled, some aren't, but it's technology that allows residents to have a point of view. And third, we're trying to think about how do you push that information back to residents? So not only how can governments use real-time crowdsourced data to make decisions, but how can residents see the data about themselves and take control of their destiny? And then I think sort of on top of all of that, we think there actually is an opportunity for communities to have more of a say about what the standards ought to be for technology that's being deployed in cities, the capabilities that government needs, that civil society needs. And that, in some ways, is the best future-proofing you can do against those technologies that are coming 4 years down the line. We're living in a world, for example, where artificial intelligence advances are sort of outstripping our ability to think about what it will mean to live alongside them and to govern them. And the response to that is not to put the halt on technology. That's impossible. The response to that is to build that capacity that will enable us to have some control over how these technologies are used. So, for example, Knight Foundation has funded with Pierre Omidyar formerly of eBay, and now the Omidyar Network, and Reid Hoffman, formerly of LinkedIn. We funded with them an effort called the Fund for the Ethics and Governance of Artificial Intelligence. And the sole question that effort is asking, and it's led by Harvard and by MIT, so people who know a little bit of what they're talking about. The question that effort is asking is not what's the next new thing we can dream up, but rather how are we going to address these critical questions of what we want this technology to do and what the parameters are going to need to be and how we can embrace it but not be controlled by it. These are complex questions, and you don't answer them by waiting. You answer them by building your sophistication to address them and to talk about them as a society.
But it's, I have a friend who talks about how he's mad that the students at the school that he teaches at, they were given all iPads instead of laptops, and he's mad because on an iPad you're kind of only allowed to do the things that are made into that baked into that system, whereas on a PC or on a Android or whatever, it's much easier to build what you need on your own platform. And so I'm wondering kind of how we start in this place where how do we move, I guess, from a place where officials and organizations work with what they see as this current system to a place where officials and individuals and organizations start to build their own systems of what they want to have available to them.
We think it comes down to expertise and capacity. I mean, it's what problem do you have the luxury to have? When 10 years ago, we didn't have the luxury of asking, should it be an proprietary closed system like an Apple technology ecosystem or an open one? It was, look, our schools are falling behind and we've got to give kids access to technology because they're going to need to know how to use it in order to be successful in the future. I think one of the great developments of the last 10 years, and I've been an observer to this space over that time, is that, it used to be that very few cities had a chief innovation or chief technology officer that was more than the IT person. And now a lot of cities, mid-sized, small cities, are on their second, third, chief technology officer, chief innovation officer. The woman who leads, Knight's work in smart cities, Lillian Corral, was the chief data officer in LA. They had a data officer, and she wasn't even the first one in the city. So as cities build that capacity and that expertise, I think their ability to engage with that level of nuance and to move from the passenger seat to the driver's seat is going to improve. We're seeing cities where we work that are moving from, hey, I'll take the technology you can give me, to the vendors to, hey, vendor, we'd love you to come into our city. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Can you help us solve our problem? And have the sophistication to kick the tires on partnerships. So, partly that will come with time. Partly that's what we, Knight Foundation, hope to invest in. And I think partly as a society, whether it's with public taxpayer money or private corporations, we've got to prioritize these questions. Communities need to be sophisticated customers if we're all going to benefit.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, I'm wondering, in that same way, there's this, when we built out the infrastructure that we often have now, whether it be suburbs or even in cities, we build to the point where we have trouble maintaining them. And that's a consistent problem now when we're talking about physical infrastructure. How do we make sure that when we're building a new digital infrastructure, we're not overbuilding our ability to maintain that?
Well, I mean, look, if I knew, I'd be too rich for this podcast. I don't, I think that's a tough question. I think some of the questions we're asking about what enables communities to be resilient in a broad sense, not just from a sustainability sense, but at a human level, at an economic level. Some of those questions I don't think we should feel too guilty about. People are trying to solve different social problems at different times. And sometimes you just don't have the ability to confront future mistakes as you're trying to solve problems. A lot of the legacy of the communities that we live in and work in, of the way they're built and the way they look like. Some of it comes from malevolence, and whether it's about class or about race. And dated views. Some of it comes from unintended consequences. And some of it comes from the unintended consequences of really noble aspirations. A lot of the ways cities have been built are part of a social engineering experiment to help sort of lift people out of poverty. Well, it turns out that if you cleave cities up by highways, that doesn't lift people out of poverty. It condemns them to poverty, and fixes and reifies some of the structures of poverty. So some of this, we don't need to feel guilty about it, but we have to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
There are other challenges, resilient challenges that we probably do need to feel guilty about, and I think maintenance is one of those. It seems to me that the incentives, at least to some extent, the incentives that govern the choices we make in the public and private sectors around maintenance just don't align with the needs. And that's something I'm certainly not an expert in, but a lot of smart people are working on. How can we align those incentives so the next generation of infrastructure, really is maintained in a way that it needs to be?
I love this idea that we shouldn't feel necessarily guilty for the ill effects of good intentions in the past, because I think there are many of us that if we see something fail, we necessarily feel guilty about it, or when we have unintended consequences, we're like, oh man, we never should have done that. And this idea that we stop saying we never should have done this and start just trying to fix the problems now, I find that really compelling. And I'm wondering if there's some way that we can maybe, when we're building something now, so when we're building the smart cities of now, is there something we can do to allow us the flexibility in the future when we see unintended consequences to respond quickly and adequately to them?
Well, I think the key word there is flexibility. And, one of the great gifts, I think, of sort of the new generation of companies, whether they're technology companies or others, is that they haven't figured it out, but they're really focused on the question of how do we organize our workforce, our product, and our strategy in a way that will be flexible. So what does flexible decision-making look like? What does flexible capital deployment look like? What's a flexible point of view about the world? How do we get information about how the world is changing? I think cities can take on some of these lessons. I think cities are going to be a part of defining what it means to be flexible in the future. There are kinds of infrastructure that are more flexible than others. There are certainly ways of organizing decision-making in your labor force that are more flexible than others. I think if we put a premium on flexibility, we give ourselves a better chance. But I don't think it's do X or do Y. I think it's rather asking the question constantly: how can we be flexible? How can we be resilient? I think one of the great gifts of the growth and resilience as a sustainability movement is that it's given us this new word for what good strategy is in the 21st century, which is strategy that can listen to, understand, and respond to change. That's one of the reasons we're so excited about this work in technology at Knight Foundation. We actually think that technology is going to be critical to enabling communities to be more responsive to change.
Well, it's I don't want to say that I'm a Luddite, but it's hard when you see some of the ways that technology has been used so ineffectively in the past to try and garner public opinion, or some of the very clunky ways that it's been attempted to be utilized before. How do you talk to people that have I'm not all the way on the end of the spectrum, but how do you talk to people that have a less than full faith that technology can answer some of these questions?
Well, look, I'd say it's warranted. I mean, ethics doesn't come from technology, it comes from people. We have ethical inclinations. We decide what we think is right and what we think is wrong. But it would be naive to say that this technology isn't invented absent those ethics. The people who created the Samsung smartphone that I'm holding up had an idea about what a more convenient life looks like that they were trying to support with the technology. Now, they might say, look, that was based in what we saw consumers wanted, so then that's the ethics, what consumers wanted. I think mobility is a great example of this. I think that the major ride-sharing companies are saying, well, look, what people want is a more convenient way to get around. Well, that's exactly right. A lot of people do want a more convenient way to get around. But what we're seeing is that ethical framework, that goal, the way that it's expressed through an Uber or a Lyft has an impact on people. It has an impact on what a neighborhood looks like. It has an impact on the people who drive taxi cabs for a living. It has an impact on the people who work for Uber or Lyft as independent contractors. at any given moment, we have the ability as a society to say, what do we want to do? And so what I would say to someone who doesn't have full faith in the power of technology is, great, you're the person who needs to be involved because your skepticism is going to enable us to say, what do we want to achieve? I feel like there are cities right now who, I think I gave this example before, cities right now who are being approached by vendors who have interesting technology solutions and who are pushing back by saying, look, we want it, but here's the problem we want to solve. We want to help seniors get to public transportation. We want to create jobs in this neighborhood. I think those are that nothing I said had to do with technology. It had to do with what we want our communities to look like. I think the people who want to bring those questions to the table are the absolute necessary people to have at the table.
Well, in some ways, that's a very challenging perspective, right? Because it requires both the technology companies and in often cases local government to go to their people and say, hey, we don't know all the answers. Tell us some of the answers that you think are out there. How do you get people to kind of embrace that collaborative process and embrace the fact that they don't know everything and they need to seek input from elsewhere?
I don't know that we figured it out. We're trying to invest in the people who we think have the best ideas about how to do that. And, some of what we've seen different things. I think, some of what we've seen is that there's no bureaucracy, whether it's a nonprofit organization or a company or a city hall, that only has one kind of person. Almost all of those bureaucracies have someone who is listening, who does look at it a different way. In fact, part of their challenge is that's all they've got. They've got people who are all listening to different groups of people. And so really smart city halls and corporations are figuring out, instead of shutting that down, how do I tap that insight? How do I create structures that eliminate that distance between the decision and the consumer, or the consumer and the decision? So I think that's one thing we've seen that's really worked. Who's that person that you can empower in a company or a city hall that can break down some of those barriers to input? I think, another thing that we're seeing in cities that I think is really exciting is how many people are just doing experimentation, low cost, low weight, kind of prototyping of things. We ran for 3 years something called the Night Cities Challenge, which was the premise was, give us your best idea to make your city better, more or less. And we got a lot of really interesting ideas. And many of them were about big challenges a particular community was facing and a small, temporary, narrow way to shift thinking and bring people together. And some of the most successful projects, all they did was change the conversation about a particular location in a city or a particular way of doing something in a city. So I think that's another thing you can do is you can test things and you can prototype things. And I think the third thing is, like, everybody chases success. If you can take a chance on an idea and it starts to be successful and then you can reinvest in it, I think, you're giving a community a way to think about something different. And earlier I talked about one of the great gifts of these emerging companies is the way they encourage us to think flexibly. I think one of the challenges of sort of this new environment is, particularly on the technology side, is the decision clock is so short that sometimes it tricks us into thinking that the decision clock should be short for everything. And the truth is that trying to help a neighborhood that is underinvested become more invested doesn't happen in a year. Trying to help a place that feels totally disengaged become more engaged, a hub of civic participation, doesn't happen in a month. And so city halls and foundations that are focused in cities and nonprofits have the unique challenge, I think, sometimes of, on the one hand, being a voice that can say, let's move further faster, and being a voice that says, hey, we move slow for a reason, because we actually need to invest, because there's actually side constraints in the system intended to prevent some of those unintended consequences. How can we take advantage of that, of being deliberate and thoughtful when we need to, without squelching new ideas, without covering our ears and not listening to really interesting ideas out there in the community?
Well, in some ways that brings to mind this idea, not necessarily of strict timeline, but that places come ready for ideas at particular times, and not every community is ready for a particular idea at every given time. And so, like, how do you, make sure that, in a place like Roanoke, our time for autonomous vehicles may be different than it is for a place like Miami? And how do you start to work that out so that your community is doing the right things at the right times?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it comes back to listening and knowing a place. And, our view is, don't try this at home. If you're not willing to have a way, we think it's having a person there and then really being open to different ideas. There's not a cookbook, but if you don't take seriously the idea that communities are different and in different places, don't invest in community, because it's more likely than not you're wasting your time and you're wasting the community's time.
Well, I wonder, as you look back at your time working at the Knight Foundation and beyond, is there something that has really helped shape your opinion? I hear you talking about listening all the time, and I love that. But I wonder if that was something learned, or kind of how you came to have the mindset that you do now.
Look, I think it's easy to say. For me, it's the great privilege of working with people who live in these places and going to these places. And actually being forced. I can say you should listen, but it's another thing to be in a room with someone, actually listen to them, and then have to render an account to your colleagues, to others. That community is going to hold you accountable. I think, one of the things our CEO, Alberto Ibargüen, reminds us is that, when the newspaper's in a community, the people who write that for that newspaper, who edit that newspaper, who run the business in that newspaper, they live with the community, and by God, they're going to hear about it if they're not of that place. I want to hear about it. I think that we try to spend as much time as we can out in these places, and that for me, that's personally been incredibly transformative. I can see, startling similarities between Miami, Florida, and Akron, Ohio, but I also see incredible dissonance between those two places, because the reality is they're different. And the way that I see it is by spending time in Miami and spending time in Akron. And what a privilege to be able to work with these incredibly diverse, exciting communities that are finding new and interesting ways to solve really big problems.
Well, I'm wondering, I love this idea of you guys. I'm extremely jealous in some ways of your ability to go different places and see these incredible things happening. Part of how I vision my own role here in Roanoke is to increase this imaginative capacity and then support those folks that have interesting ideas. But one of the difficulties with that is that it becomes hard when you're not there seeing the impacts of that on a day-to-day basis. And I kind of wonder what you do to make sure that you're close enough and that you have enough time to see that impact and be rejuvenated in some ways by being present in those places.
It's by doing that, it's by making the time. I think smart companies spend time with their customer, and so you just got to make the time, to spend time with your customer. Again, we're investing in the good ideas of others. Mm-hmm. And so we've got a string tied, we have a connection, that shame on us if we don't use it to keep learning and to be close to what's going on.
Well, as you go to these different places, I'm wondering if there's something that you do when you first get off the plane or the train or out of the car. What's something that you're looking for, that either physical, psychological, structurally, that lets you know that some place is doing well, or that tips you off as to kind of what the status of that particular place is?
Everywhere I go, whether it's someone I'm meeting formally or I run into at the airport or at a restaurant, I ask, where do you live? First of all, do you live downtown? Do you live in an outlying neighborhood? Do you live in a suburb? I always want to know, where do you live? Why do you live there? And then, I always ask people, what do you like about this place? Because first of all, I find people rarely say something clear, but they always say something honest. So people rarely say, oh, it's the schools, but they'll always say something like, it feels like a great place for my kids to grow up. And that, I think that is a great invitation to keep learning. It's a great invitation to keep learning, and it's a great way to build a connection to a community, because a community is the people who live there. It's really nothing else.
I'm really intrigued by this. Is it an intentional way to start with something positive instead of, why not ask, in some ways, tell me about your place, or, you know, what's your favorite restaurant or something like that? Why is it that you start in this very positive place of what do you love about your community?
Well, as you know, most people don't actually move in and out of communities except for a job or a major family reason. It's the much more common moves are within a community. Least common is from place to place. Next least common is within a region, and then the sort of most common is within a place that you live. A lot of that is, people have jobs, or there's economic barriers to moving, or they've got family they need to be close to. So the question to me often is not, look, why did you choose to be here, or why would you leave if you could? It's rather, do you in some way identify with the place? And I find that people who don't feel that connected to the place, if you ask them, what do you like about this place? They're not going to tell you something positive. They're going to start with, well, it's hard. It's hard because we don't really feel like we've got a good place for our kids to go to school. I find people will tell you, like I said, they're not going to give you a clear answer, but they are going to give you an honest answer. And I find that helpful. But hey, this isn't a scientific survey, so there might be a better way to ask the question. It works for me.
Well, that sounds like a job for the smart city technology moving forward here.
Actually, you say that as a joke, but I have to say, one of the cool things about this thing called the smartphone is it actually tells you a lot about what's important to people about the places they live and where they need to spend time and where they want to spend time. So, even though I actually think, again, to your question of what do you say to the technology skeptic is put this thing to work for you. It's already answering a lot of the critical questions, but it's not telling us the answers in a way that we can make choices.
That, I think that raises this massive question for me in terms of skill set. In that, in some ways, the biggest question for me in terms of smart cities is how do we get the people that have the right skill set in the right place to analyze this new set of data and or to equip and build a new system to do that. And so I'm wondering kind of what, are you guys doing anything or seeing anything that that provides that training for employees or hiring the right people in, or what? How have you guys seen that be successful in places?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely invested in growing the leadership capacity of the cities where we work on both in the civil society side and government, and at different points in the pipeline. So for people who are more mid-career, we organize tours to different kinds of cities. I mean, these are experts who want new ideas they can bring back, who want to challenge their own thinking. So that's helpful for them. We do design studios and things like that for folks who are mid-career where they want to work on a problem. Earlier in career, we try to put a spotlight on people. So can we give someone sometimes a small grant to pursue an idea is a way of investing in that person's capacity. It puts a spotlight on them. It gives them credibility, and it gives them some resources to try something out and learn. We work with an organization called 880 Cities, led by Gill to do something called the Emerging City Champions, which is taking early career people, sending them on a kind of short residency together where they can coach and counsel each other, and then we give them some resources to try something out. So it's something we definitely invest in, and it's clearly an important opportunity in a lot of communities.
Well, I feel like we could talk about this all day, Sam, but I wonder if you could kind of close us out with a story that encapsulates what happens when communities become engaged and empowered and start to use the tools available to them in new and appropriate ways.
I think something we're really excited about is our work around public spaces in Philadelphia. Every city's got public spaces as a function of the infrastructure that they have. They've got parks, they've got libraries, they've got plazas, they've got things like that. A lot of cities are not experiencing these places as real drivers of a culture of civic engagement. We saw an opportunity in Philadelphia several years ago in collaboration with foundations like William Penn Foundation to start to change the thinking in Philadelphia. There were some emerging folks who saw what was happening in Center City, Philadelphia, around a really dense, a dense kind of focused public culture. Saw an opportunity to take that out to the rest of the city, to other neighborhoods. And so we invested in kind of a pilot that we called Reimagining the Civic Commons. It was about taking these commons and helping to revitalize them and connect them. And the city government was interested, but they would be the first to tell you we weren't going to be able to do this on our own. And we brought that unique perspective about what a culture of civic engagement could look like. Well, several years later, not only is that thriving in Philadelphia, not only are there a number of these places that are now coming online and connecting up to each other, but the city's investing a ton more money. Their sort of neighborhood redevelopment strategy called Rebuild is going to be focused on public places. The other partners have continued to make major investments, and we're trying the approach out in a few other cities where we invest in collaboration with others, with the Kresge Foundation, JBP Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. To me, that's what it's all about. It's about, again, tapping into something that was already there, following the momentum in the community, but also taking on something that others couldn't, but wanted to. And so now the sum total of resources and energy in Philadelphia and beyond is sort of much larger as a result of what we and others were able to do.
Well, very cool. I wonder, looking forward, if people are interested in finding out more about the work you guys are doing in Philadelphia, Miami, wherever that might be, where can they find out more information?
Yeah, really easy. knightfoundation.org. And we want to hear from anyone who's got an opinion about our work.
Very good. And if you guys are interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Sam.
Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.